Hello, my name is John Burgess. I'm an American writer and journalist, and I've had a deep interest in the Angkor civilization of Southeast Asia for many years. That interest began really with my first visit to its old capital at age 18, when I was just out of high school. Today, I'm going to tell you a bit about that civilization, which by its political name is called the Khmer Empire. You can think of it as the ancient version of the present day country Cambodia. To the extent Cambodia is known in the United States these days, it's often in terms of the tragic modern history of war and genocide. Its glorious ancient history doesn't get its due in terms of popular awareness. We all grow up knowing the basics about Roman or Egyptian civilization, but not so with Angkor, even though it dominated much of Southeast Asia for close to 6 centuries and left an amazing legacy. It barely shows up in American popular culture. Some of the few examples that I can think of is that part of the first Tomb Raider movie was filmed at Angkor, and a great Khmer king is a character in the Age of Empires video games. So I'm very excited that you're interested in the subject, and I think that Angkor has a lot that can engage American high school students. You start with stunningly beautiful stone temples from 1,000 years ago, many of them still covered with vines and other tropical growth after sitting essentially untended in the forest for many centuries. Then you add a history of conquest, of empire building, of heroism in battle, of thrones gained and lost. There's really quite a bit to chew on here. So let me today give you an outline of this history, of the culture, the personalities, and the great architectural accomplishments. Now let's start with two things that have become emblematic of this civilization. One is this temple, Angkor Wat is its name. It was built in the first half of the 12th century. It was dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, and in my opinion, has the rare combination of monumental scale. Its moats measure about 3.5 miles around, and aesthetic perfection. And this is not to mention perfection of workmanship. It can seem like every one of its sandstone blocks is carved with sculpture or with decoration and fits perfectly together. Taken together, the temple forms an architectural depiction of the cosmos of the Hindu religion. Its towers represent Mount Meru, home of the Hindu gods. Its moats represent another fundamental element of Hindu cosmology, the sea of creation. Now, walking through Angkor Wat is truly unforgettable. You feel you're surrounded by history, spirituality, and some of the greatest creative genius that humankind has ever produced. Now, the other icon of the Angkor civilization is this, these huge stone faces with these enigmatic smiles. They're carved into the towers of temples and processional gates. They're widely believed to meld two identities, a compassionate, almost Buddha, and the king of the time, Jayavarman VII. Now, going forward, I'm going to be using the word Angkor as a place name. It means the area around the town of Siem Reap in Cambodia, where the Khmer Empire was based for most of those 6 centuries, roughly as long as Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire. Angkor Wat is a specific temple there, but just one of many. Angkor was a city of temples, yes, but also a city of palaces and huts, markets, canals, reservoirs, roads and bridges, circuses, soldiers, and corrals where work elephants were kept. It was the capital of a great imperial realm, where kings staged victory parades on return from battlefield campaigns. It probably had a population of upwards of 500,000 people at its peak. The scale of the place is really, truly enormous. Let me show you the view from space. The big rectangle at the upper left, this one up here, is a reservoir. that the ancient Khmer's built. It measures roughly 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It's created entirely by the sweat of human labor and probably work elephants. The square at the bottom, this one here, is those moats of Angkor Wat that I mentioned earlier. And this big square up here is a walled city known as Angkor Thom, surrounded by moats and walls that are maybe 15 to 20 feet high. Now, this is the airport for comparison. You can see how small it is. And you'll notice how everything except the airport, which was built in modern times, obviously, has a strict east-west, north-south orientation. That's a spiritual consideration that's found in almost all Khmer architecture. Now, let's turn to history. The Cambodian people have a creation myth. In the myths of prehistory, there's a marriage between an Indian priest named Kondinya and a princess named Soma. She is the daughter in human form of the king of the holy water serpents. From this union comes the Cambodian people. Now, this is a myth, but it lines up with the consensus theory among historians that around the middle of the first millennium, there was a small-scale migration from India to Cambodia, including Hindu priests. And these priests married into the aristocracy of small principalities that were already there. The religion, the Sanskrit language, these were brought by these priests, along with this sort of Hindu way of life. And these things mixed with local religions and cultures to create a new culture, which became the culture of this great empire. Now, the empire is generally believed to have been founded in the year 802 AD by a prince who united a collection of these small principalities. It expanded over later years, and at its height in the 12th century, which you see here on this map, it included Cambodia, southern Vietnam, and much of Thailand and Laos. In the early 1100s, a dynamic new king by the name of Suryavarman II came to the throne and shored up an empire that was actually starting to fray around the edges a little. Here you see him on his throne in a bas-relief, a stone carving in a wall at Angkor Wat. Those parasols overhead symbolize his extremely high rank. Angkor Wat, in fact, was his temple. He oversaw its construction. Its bas-reliefs also give us views of royal pageantry. Here's his cavalry on display, with soldiers marching behind the horse. Here you see some court ladies, and I like how one of them is tending to the child below her. Here's another view of a court lady. You see her right in the center. She's sitting on a palanquin, a conveyance that's being carried by servants. And what she's doing actually is she's examining the bud of a lotus flower that she's holding up to her eyes. Now, in 1177, the empire suffered a disastrous setback when armies from a neighboring kingdom called Champa invaded the empire and captured Angkor. But another great king appeared. His name was Jayavarman VII, and he rallied the Khmer forces and drove out the invaders. Now here we see him atop a chariot directing his troops who were marching in front of him and behind him. Again, you see parasols above him to indicate his great rank. Here are some of his soldiers, looking very, very stern and formidable on the battlefield. Now, there was a long war with Champa to reclaim the kingdom. And again, we get to see this war in action. Here we have a line of Khmer soldiers, each armed with a spear and probably wearing something that's some kind of armor. And the people generally didn't wear things on the top of their bodies. And you can see behind the soldiers, there's a war elephant. So they're all moving up toward battle. A lot of this this particular war, in fact, was fought on water. There were giant fighting boats that both sides have. And here you see actually one of the cham boats with soldiers on the top, again, each one armed with a spear, and the rowers sitting on the bottom facing the other way, as you do in a rowboat. And they are actually confronting with a Khmer boat on the left, which you can't see, but there's lots of detail about the realities of warfare in those days. And on the left over here, you can see some grappling hooks that the Khmer fighters have thrown onto the cham boat to essentially reel it in. Now, eventually, the Chams were vanquished, and Jayavarman became one of the greatest kings of the empire, and he embarked on an enormous building program that left us many of the temples that we see today. He also built this walled city, Angkor Thom, which I mentioned earlier. Jayavarman also changed the state religion from Hinduism to Buddhism. He was not only a great warrior, but he was a very accomplished practitioner of that religion. He ruled alongside two famous queens who were known for piety, benevolence, and the creation of orphanages and hospitals. Some people believe that this is a depiction of one of them, Queen Jayaraja Devi. Now, we basically know only the bare bones of these events. The historical record of Angkor is quite thin compared to what we know about, say, ancient Rome. Most of the Khmer Empire's records were kept on palm leaf, and over the centuries, these rotted away and disappeared. Most of what we know comes from sources such as these bas-reliefs that I've been showing you, the accounts of Chinese travelers who visited the empire, and very stylized and formalized inscriptions that are found carved into the stone of many of the temples. This is what they look like. But from all these sources, we can piece together the basics of Khmer history and get a picture of Khmer society. Most of the early kings were Hindus, the faith that made its way from India. Later ones, like Jayavarman VII, were Buddhists. Ordinary people were probably, for the most part, animists, that is, worshippers of spirits that were believed to inhabit basically everything: houses, trees, rivers, fields. Hinduism and Buddhism seem to have been for the aristocrats. Whichever faith was followed, though, religion basically imbued every aspect of life. Now, as best we can tell, Khmer society was organized into a collection of rural estates. In Europe, we think of the castle as the centerpiece of the estates that form the building blocks of society in medieval times. In the Khmer Empire, which existed at roughly the same time as medieval Europe, it was typically a temple that was at the center of an estate. And this temple's upkeep was the responsibility of the people who lived on that estate. Today, you can find ruins of these comparatively small temples scattered all over the empire's former realm. Here's one from northern Cambodia, and as you can see, it's still overgrown, and it's maintained by local people as a spirit shrine. You can see there's something inside the chamber there. Now, here's another provincial temple located in present-day Thailand, and it's been heavily rebuilt, as you can see. Its name is Sudok Kok Thom, and it was here that the most important inscription of the entire Khmer Empire was found. Now, these inscriptions often give very detailed accounts of who built a particular temple, how many golden bowls and how many priestly garments were donated to it, and just how the temple was maintained, who was responsible and what were their duties. After all, it's a very expensive operation to keep a temple like this going. The inscription from this temple, along with quite a few other things, spells out a work schedule for keeping the place running. One team from a local village would work the 2 weeks of the waxing moon to be replaced by another team that would do the 2 weeks of the waning moon. So teams would go there and work for 2 weeks, and their time was basically determined by the phases of the moon. Now, the king owned almost all of the empire's land, but he distributed rights to various nobles in return for loyalty and tribute. Nobles of the estate were generally free to do what they want, to rule as they wanted, as long as they sent their tribute to the king on schedule. And this could include food or soldiers or other things that had been promised, and of course, personal loyalty. The nobles were often advised by hereditary families of Hindu priests. At Sedokoktom, there was such a family, and they created this great inscription that was found there. Now, the ideal king was wise and fully versed in the sacred text, but feeling constant compassion for his people. Here's a description of one of them from the Sedokoktom inscription. It says, quote, "As a teacher exhorts his disciples, or a father his children, with eyes fixed on duty, the king strove tirelessly for the protection and prosperity of his people," unquote. But kings were also supposed to be fearless warriors. And here's a description of that same king. Quote, "In battle, he bore a sword red with blood of enemy kings it had slain. The sword cast a dazzling light in all directions like a ravishing red lotus," unquote. Now, Khmer society was clearly male-dominated, but it also had room for prominent women. One such woman named Tilaka is described in an inscription in this way. Quote, "Pure and beautiful, she had a divine nature that was not questioned," unquote. The inscription recounts her command of holy texts and the many honors that she was granted in recognition of her piety. Now, there were plenty of revolts in Khmer society, plenty of usurping of thrones, but by and large, peace and order seem to have generally reigned. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to build all of those temples. That required order and organization. Now, we don't know the names of many ordinary Khmers, the people whose sweat made this construction possible, but we do get to see a lot of them in these same bas-reliefs. Ones created in the 12th century, many of them show scenes of royal life and warfare, but they also show amazing views of everyday existence. Here's what seems to be a fortune telling going on. A young couple has come to hear their future from this fortune teller who's examining the woman's palm. And I like how the man's got his arm very, very casually draped over the woman's shoulder. Here are some women, some masons at work. And for all the construction went on, there are actually very few views of the actual work. But here in the middle, you can see a man kneeling down with a hammer and chisel to work the stone that's beneath him. This man has an axe and is breaking stone, and this man over here has some kind of lever that he's using to lift a piece of stone. Here we see childbirth. There's a woman in the throes of giving birth in the middle, and she's tended by two midwives on either side of her. Here's what seems to be a restaurant or maybe a palace kitchen, and you see servants running around preparing these trays of food, and down here you see a cauldron of some kind, and this man here is tending the fire. And I showed you pictures of the actual battle before, but here's a picture of a military family trudging toward the battlefield as part of a long procession of soldiers. And here you see the father in the middle carrying one of the children on his shoulders, and this woman, probably his wife, behind him, an older child here, And over here, walking beneath the cart, is the family dog, or so it looks. Now, we can probably see real people in these kinds of sculpted women who appear all over Angkor Wat. Generally, it's slightly less than life size. There are close to 1,800 of these women carved just at that one temple. Their faces are individual faces. The style, the carving style varies, indicating that a lot of people carved them and that a lot of different women posed. It's an interesting aside that a century ago, the daughter of the chief archaeologist at Angkor Wat spent years studying these figures and trying to figure out how their clothing was cut and worn and what kind of accessories they had. You can see this woman is dressed in a very fancy way. She has armlets, she has a necklace, she has a long sash that's coming out from her waist, and then she's wearing this elaborate headdress made out of lotus buds. But a lot of the sculpture at Angkor is not about the here and now, but about the times of Hindu myth. These stories, like the here and now stories, include a great deal of battle, like this picture from Angkor Wat, which shows a divine figure standing atop a chariot and shooting his bow, and you can see he has superhuman powers because he's shooting, it looks like 4 arrows at once. It looks like this battle is not going well. His chariot driver down here has been killed by an arrow. But another very commonly depicted scene that we see is a scene from Hindu mythology known as the churning of the Sea of Milk, in which gods and demons churn the sea to create a substance known as the elixir of immortality. Here we see gods on the left, demons on the right, and they're pulling on the body of a holy serpent. You can see here, and that body is wrapped around this great pivot. And up here, the god Vishnu is overseeing this process, which went on for thousands of years, we're told. And then down at the bottom, the stake is resting on a holy turtle named Kurma. Now, this is a comparatively simple depiction found at a temple called Prayavahir, but Angkor Wat has a very complex one. And you can see how much higher the sort of degree of the quality of the carving and the depiction is here. Here we see Vishnu in the center with his 4 arms, and we see the gods on the right and the demons on the left, and the holy turtle down here. Here's a detail of the row of gods, and you can see there's a great hierarchy among the gods. There are the lesser gods, the smaller ones, and there are this one in the middle. And it is said that from this great churning, this great disturbing of the oceans, gave birth to all of these holy creatures that you see at the top, known as Apsara. And here's one more image, a close-up of the head of the turtle that's in the middle, and you can see how, to show that he is in fact a divine turtle, he's wearing a little crown. Now, everyone in Southeast Asia knows the scene, and I'll show you one more depiction of it. Oh, excuse me, this scene was also depicted quite often in freestanding sculpture, and this is a row of demons all sitting together to pull on the body of the serpent, which you see down here. This is a story that to this day is known all over Southeast Asia, and here you see a depiction of it that greets you when you arrive at Bangkok's airport, which shows these life-size figures, again, gods on this side and demons on the other. And there you see the multiple heads of the serpent, and at the top, Vishnu overseeing the whole process. Now, Angkor is probably best known for its architecture. So in the last section of this talk, let me sort of give you a survey of the main buildings and a little bit about them, a sort of chronological tour. No one has ever quite answered the question of how this society was able to accomplish such tremendous feats of discipline that it took to build these places. The temples are so huge that they consume the energies and treasure of entire generations, just like the pyramids in Egypt did. But the answer probably combines social order and religious faith, plus the availability of building materials and an artistic tradition of how to build buildings and how to make them symbolize what you wanted them to symbolize. Probably competition among kings to build something bigger and better than the previous king also played a role. Now, the original architectural inspiration, along with the religion, came from India. Here we have what's known as the Shore Temple in southern India, dating from the 8th century. And looking at it, you can easily see some cultural kinship with the Khmer temples in terms of the towers, stonework, and images that you can see in small scale down at the bottom. But the Khmer temples are by no means simple imitations of Indian temples. The architectural forms evolved to new heights, literally new heights, under the Khmer's tutelage, and took forms that were never seen in India. As with Angkor Wat, the basic symbolism of most all of these temples is Mount Meru. It's the generally five-peaked home of the gods, located in the Himalayan mountains. In an Angkor temple, the towers represent the mountain's peaks, and the moats and ponds on the ground around them represent the sea of creation that surrounds Mount Meru. Now, worship generally takes place in multiple small shrines that are inside, with the most holy of the shrines being the shrine that's inside the central tower. Typically, a temple would have many of these shrines, darkness, but lit by candles or lamps of some kind, very small chambers generally. And in the holiest of the holy places, only the king and aristocrats and priests probably would have gone inside to conduct religious rituals. Now, early Khmer temples are small by the standards of what came later. Here's one called Preah Ko, and it dates to about the year 880 AD. The typical design is a platform with multiple towers, each with a shrine inside, and you can see freestanding sculpture is set up outside, and there are bas-reliefs on the walls of the temple. And as you can see, the brick, in this case covered by stucco, is the main material. But as we go forward, the Khmers start to build in sandstone, which is abundantly available all over, in many places of Cambodia. The geologists say the whole country is sort of sitting on a great sandstone foundation, and in places it pokes up to the surface. Here you see it showing itself on a riverbank near Angkor and bearing the traces of ancient quarrying. Now, I say visible building material because you can get the feeling that sandstone materials are sandstone through and through, solid sandstone. But in fact, it's often just a facing that covers up more common material, often a soft stone-like material called laterite, or sometimes even just dirt and sand. The insides of the Khmer temples are not made out of stone. And that over time turned out to be a great problem for their long-term lasting. As the style evolved, the Khmers began to build pyramids, getting bigger and bigger. And this is the largest of the pyramids that they built. We can imagine that there was some kind of shrine at the top, but to get a feeling for the size of this place, look at this human figure down here. It's really an enormous structure. Again, moving forward, the style began to be tiered temples with towers on the top. This is one called Pre Rup, dating to about 960 AD. And then we get to Angkor Wat, which is the great culmination of this style, but with towers that have this pleasing, curved shape of a closed lotus bulb. I took this photo in 1980 when not many people were visiting Angkor, and these boys were headed for water to try to catch fish. That's a fish trap that the boy on the left is carrying. Now, in the late 1100s, something amazing happens. The Khmers essentially fuse architecture and sculpture. The Bayon is the best known of these places. It's the temple with the countless giant stone faces facing in the four cardinal directions. The whole temple really can seem to be like just a giant piece of sculpture. And here's what some of these faces look like close up. Again, the enigmatic smile, looking in all directions. This same style was used in the 5 gates that lead in and out of the walled city Angkor Thom, which was built to protect against future invasions from the Chams, or anyone else for that matter. This is a gate known as the East Gate. This is a gate known as the Victory Gate. It's believed that victorious armies paraded through this gate on returning to the capital from campaigns in the battlefields. And you can see here, this is a close-up of one of the gates, and you can see how elaborately they were carved even in this grand scale. There are the 4 faces, of course, but you can see secondary figures here and down here. And look here at the detail that went into the hair of this figure over here. It's really quite remarkable, the detail that they were able to capture even in this grand scale. Now, I should mention that the Khmers also constructed an astounding water system at Angkor. It's an absolutely vast network of canals, moats, reservoirs, and diverted rivers that brings water down from the hills north of Angkor and moves it around the plain. Archaeologists are still struggling to figure out how did this work and what was its meaning and purpose. It seems to have had both symbolic purposes to symbolize, an earthly depiction of the Sea of Creation, but also to have very practical purposes of controlling flooding, filling these moats, and saving up water for irrigation to grow food, rice, for the city's huge population. Some of the greatest beauty in Angkor really is the water. And you see here the view from one of the corners of Angkor Thom City. You're at the top of the wall here at the corner. And you see the moat beyond it. And the moat, like the wall, is making a 90-degree turn. Here's a section of Angkor Wat's moat with, on the left, steps that people could use to go down, descend, and bathe in the moat. Now, sometime in the 13th or the 14th century, Angkor began a slow decline. People began leaving the city and abandoning most of the temples to the elements. There's been endless study and theorizing about why this happened. Various explanations include drought, military pressure, change in religion, social exhaustion over having to maintain so many huge temples, and desire to be closer to trade routes. No one really can be sure, because there's no written record. But in recent times, I would say the theory of environmental crisis, drought in particular, has been gaining increasing credibility. And some of that research is done through the examination of the rings in trees, in old trees, in which a thick ring indicates a year of good rain and a very thin ring indicates a year of bad rain. And by piecing this evidence together, environmental experts are able to determine that there were 20 and 30-year-long droughts in this period when this great abandonment was going on. Now, the royal court moved toward the east and set up new capitals near Phnom Penh, which is the capital of modern-day Cambodia. The empire's end is normally given as 1431. That was the year that an army from Siam captured Angkor. But in one sense, the empire never ended. It just got smaller. Over the centuries, under military pressure from Siam and Vietnam, the Khmer Empire shrank down to become today's Cambodia, which you see here. Now, in 1863, the French began a colonization of Cambodia. The journal of this man, Henri Mouot, he was a French naturalist. His journal was published after his death, and it brought the temples to the world's attention, though he was by no means the first foreigner to visit. He spent 2 weeks at Angkor in 1860 and created a fascinating account with sketches and lofty prose describing the glories and melancholy of the ruins of what he saw. Now, the French colonial authorities took a strong interest in clearing the overgrowth of the temples and rebuilding some of them and recovering an understanding of history that had actually been almost completely forgotten. They invited the world to come and see Angkor. They encouraged tourism. This is one of my favorite photographs of tourism in the French colonial period. If you had a lot of money, you could arrive by seaplane, landing in the moat of Angkor Wat. And here we see 3 tourists posing for the camera while the pilot sits in his seat very nonchalantly. And that is the entryway to Angkor Wat in the background. Charlie Chaplin actually visited Angkor in 1936, though he came by road and not by air. Slowly, Angkor became the symbol of the modern Cambodian state. It came to be on the national flag, on banknotes, on postage stamps. Cambodians learned about it in school, and they took an immense pride in it. And this pride helped along the cause of Cambodian nationalism, which eventually resulted in the French leaving and Cambodia becoming independent again. In modern times, Angkor has become an object of military conquest, notably during Cambodia's very long civil war, which ran from 1970 to the 1990s. Different factions occupied it at different times, each of them wanting to show that it controlled the heart of the Cambodian nation. Luckily, Angkor largely avoided bombs and bullets in this period, but the wars took a very serious toll in terms of neglect and art theft that became possible due to lawlessness. But with its reopening in the 1990s, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Reconstruction and maintenance began. Here you see a crane assisting in reconstruction work at a temple called Phnom Bakeng. Angkor also became an international tourist magnet, eventually drawing more than 2 million foreigners a year. And here you see some of them visiting Angkor Wat, and I can tell you that there were times when this avenue was much more crowded than what you see here. There began to be concern in some quarters that the press of the crowds was threatening the temples. Here you see some tourists mixing with Cambodians who were getting married at Angkor. There's a photo shoot going on. Getting married at the temples is a favorite thing in contemporary culture. So tourists visited the temples during the day. They came back to hotels for swimming and nice dinners and strolls in some very busy markets. Uh, but for right now, in early 2021, Angkor is basically devoid of foreign tourists due to coronavirus travel restrictions. So for foreigners, it's the perfect time to go if only you could get there. Some people like to say that the virus gave Angkor back to the Cambodians, but no doubt tourism will pick up again in the years ahead. And this brings me to the end. I want to say thanks for watching, and I do hope that some of you will get a chance to visit Angkor. And whether you go or not, I hope that I've made clear why it might be worth teaching. It truly is an unforgettable place. So thank you very much for listening.